Hello guys, back again. When I first saw this story, it immediately came to me, this has got to be April Fool's prank, right? This is the time of the year for it. I had to go search to make sure not just one site was running the story in this article, because if it is an April Fool's prank joke, you got to check to make sure, if multiple sites have the same story, it's unlikely it's a prank. And it is about Square Enix, a company that a lot of people have had very torn opinions of this last generation. Going into this generation, when we were coming out of the PS2 era, everybody fell in love. Square Enix was like fell in love with, right? They could do no wrong. They were making RPGs everybody wanted to play. The popularity of this, Final Fantasy had just been like shooting through the roof. And then we hit this last generation, and one, it took a while for Square Enix to roll into this generation with a Final Fantasy game, but they came out with other ones that kind of just didn't hit the mark, right? I mean, a lot of people like Nier, but there were other games that didn't hit the mark. And so for Square, this was a very unusual generation for games. And a lot of people had quietly seen Square had lost its way. Now, Square Enix had lost a lot of talent that made, the original. Depends on which ones you liked. It was original 8, 10, original 12. They had eventually lost their way. One of the biggest things I hate that Square's done is both MMOs 11 and 14 were named numbered Final Fantasy games. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, because I do not believe those should be numbered, because later on down the road you got these two big holes. Are you going to change that MMO and take that whole world and you're going to put it into a single player game someday? Which could possibly happen, because as systems get more powerful and more memory, you could kind of fit that whole world in there. But I mean, Final Fantasy 11 is still being supported. It still gets a new expansion every year, so it's not like Final Fantasy 11 hasn't been around for a long time. And they haven't, the fans haven't got their money's worth who played that game. And that you got to give them credit where credit's due. When 14 came out, it was just an abysmal train wreck. Instead of giving up on it, they spent the money and they fixed it and re-released it. And everybody seems to like it. Though it will be funny down the road if the disaster version of that game is worth something, because how many people may have not bought it or forgot about it. But that's a different story for another day. But what was interesting about the story to me was that what Square Enix had said, because they're rethinking their approach after Bravely Default has done so well. Now, Bravely Default is a 3DS game. It has gone back to the roots of what made Final Fantasy great, the old school roots of Final Fantasy. And obviously the guy who made this game had made a Final Fantasy game before, and this was originally supposed to be a sequel to a numbered Final Fantasy game, but Square thought instead to make it something on its own. And the original plans, what was rumored out there, that what they originally were going to do is Bravely Default would come out every year or every other year on the handheld as the old school RPG, and then of course the Final Fantasy that, like 13, whether people like it or not, was going to come out also, so that, depending on which one you liked, you could play that. But these newer games haven't done as well as they expected. A lot of games in general Square has come out with hasn't come out expected. And so in this interview, basically, the president of Square Enix had said that they had lost its focus. That they were trying to make games that appealed to a worldwide market. Not only did they end up, being games that weren't for the Japanese, which is what a lot of people played Square Enix games to begin with, but they ended up being incomplete titles that weren't even fit for a global audience. And what's interesting about this, he brings up Hitman Absolution, which is the first Square's Hitman game that came out, talking about how, that the game had a hard time in attempting to appeal, to its audience. It suffered because they tried to make the game appeal to everybody instead of making the game appeal to its core audience, which is why people bought the game, was what the game did. You were a hitman, you weren't to be seen, and instead they made it into something else, and it offended the core fans, and then the people who never played it before played it and didn't like it either. So in a sense, not many people even noticed the new Hitman game came out. And if you're going to make a game for a series, like Hitman was a popular series, but if you got a core base to your a game, you got to make sure you make that game to what the fan base likes. Hitman is a certain kind of game. There are certain rules that have been there from the beginning. This is what this game's like. You got to be sneaky. You got to go in there and take the guys out or whatever. And when you lost that element of the game, you lost what made the game great for a lot of people. And he talked about how, Bravely Default was such a niche title for the hardcore JRPG fans, but it helped Square Enix rethink its approach, because he said, on the other hand, there are games like JRPG we made for the Japanese audience with the proper elements, Bravely Default, which ended up selling very well around the world. I mean, it even made the top 10 here when it came out. And that, Square has suffered over the last year. They've had to restructure many of their operations. They took extraordinary loss at the beginning of 2013. And the company now is expecting to get back to profitability with the success, ironically enough, of all things, the relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV, because the relaunch was a success. And it's funny, because when they originally spent the money to redo that, I thought, why would you do that? That Final Fantasy XIV is now a broken brand, that because the launch was so bad, people aren't going to go back to it. But you know what? They released a demo, people liked it, and it's done very well for them. And he's, one of the points he said, if you focus too much on global aspect, you might lose sight of what you're actually making the game for. He said, for example, if you look back in 2013, we had some home console games made for global audiences that struggled. And he mentioned, of course, Hitman in this article. He said that the development team for the game really struggled in this regard, trying to make a game that appealed to the global audience. They implemented a vast amount of elements for the mass instead of the core fans as a way to try to getting as many new players as possible. It was a strategy to gain mass appeal. However, what makes the Hitman series good is its appeal to core gamers, and many fans felt a lack of focus in that regard, which ended up making it struggling sales. So, Square Enix is supposedly now refocusing their efforts on returning its AAA series to the roots in their appeal. And one of the biggest problems they have is they've lost the Japanese audience, which was their most loyal audience from the beginning, with their JRPGs, that, what they did and here's one of the things that cracks up. We can go all the way back to the DS. One of the things that got DS appeal, besides the DS Lite, which was very, obviously, much user-friendly and a great little handheld, was that, like, Nintendo started bringing over Japanese games that traditionally would have been brought over here for the system, like Brain Age and stuff, and they found out what's popular in Japan also could be popular here. You just gotta give people a chance to buy it. And this old myth that what works over here doesn't work over there doesn't necessarily apply anymore. Yes, what works for Western audiences in some ways will not appeal to the Japanese market, and there are some things about the Japanese market that will not appeal to the Western market. But overall, certain basic themes and certain gameplay will always translate over each market, even if it is a niche market. The other thing I have a problem with developers like Square is, if you make a game and you know that game is not going to sell very well, that does not mean you make 1 million copies. You need to take the Atlas strategy, which is, we're going to make this niche game, and we know it's niche, so we're only going to make this many copies of it when we release it. If they sell more than that, they'll release more. And that's where, especially with RPGs, I think that's where a lot of these guys got to go until they can prove to them that they can sell very well. But he said, basically, the AAA titles we're currently developing for series, we basically want to go back to the roots and focus on the core audience while working hard on content that can have fans saying things like, this is Hitman we know, and I believe this is the best way for our development studio to display their strengths, concluded the president. So, what they're trying to say is they're trying to get back to their roots. And one of the biggest roots they need to get back to me, is the JRPG. What made their JRPGs great? Great characters, great story. I mean, Final Fantasy always had a lot of little things to do, right? It wasn't just, you go in there and, hey, there might be a casino here, there might be something else there, exploration. At least try to give us a linear world that doesn't necessarily look linear. So, we'll see if they can get back to the roots. They need to get back to the roots in the JRPG market, because I think if they do, it'll help the JRPG market in general. If Square can get back to the roots and make the games that appeal to the fans who love JRPGs, then it's going to help the market at all. Because let's be honest, when Square made Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 at the time, ultimately accumulating to 10, to me those are the 4 games that just got insanely popular. The Final Fantasy 7 was the start of it. The JRPG market took off. People who normally didn't play JRPGs started playing JRPGs, and they liked it. And the genre just took off. In order for the genre to take off again, they need someone to make games that appeal to everybody so that people start to notice the market. And we'll see if they can do it. Again, they've lost a lot of people over the time that we're talking about, where they had all these struggles. This generation, they lost a lot of talent that had been around to make Final Fantasy popular. And so we'll see hopefully they can get back to their base. I think if they use Bravely Default as like the blueprint going forward to JRPGs for hopefully next gen consoles, they can get it right. Then we'll see. Because last generation to me was, I struggle for JRPGs. That it just seemed you get to a point where you can make games like, okay, the 8, 16-bit, even 32-bit, they got the JRPGs down. But it seems certain points, certain generations, games struggle, and that was definitely a struggle for JRPGs to find more than just a niche audience appeal. Anyway, enough of me babbling. I've been babbling on this for over 10 minutes now. So, guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and favoring. I really do appreciate it. And I will talk to you guys later.